Welcome to another episode of Carolyn Talks Television. I'm Carolyn Topol, and this is my fabulous co-host, Rachel Arnett.
Hello.
And we are continuing right in the middle of our series on family viewing through the decades. Right now, we are going to hit the 1980s, but right before we do that, we wanted to do a quick follow-up. Last time, we did our Emmy predictions and a little Emmy preview. Well, as the show is taping, the Emmys haven't aired yet. So we're still as curious as you are at home about what would be happening. So we will address the Emmy results in our next episode. So it'll seem a little bit later, but we haven't missed it, and we didn't, miss the mark on that. No. It just hasn't viewed yet for us.
Doesn't exist yet. No.
Doesn't exist yet. But I'm looking forward to the show because it's host-free. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
By now, you'll have your opinions.
Oscars,
yeah.
So.
Oscars did well. Their ratings went up. So we'll see what happens with the Emmys.
Yeah.
But now that we had our little announcement, our little public service announcements, we will go back to the 1980s and family viewing. And family viewing in the 80s, in my opinion, and this was the decade that, early in this decade, I got married. So I was now an adult. Not only did I get married, this is the decade that I also started having kids and started watching with a child later on.
That's when I was born.
And that's when she was a kid.
I was a kid for the last, I was born in end of 85. So
it was half the
about
decade.
5 years.
Yeah.
I got about half of the 80s in me.
There you go. And so you'll actually remember some of the shows we talk about family viewing.
I finally will have seen them growing up.
And if you didn't see them the first time, we got you in the reruns, but you'll know what we're talking about as firsthand. The 80s, now tell me if you're not disagree with me.
Yeah.
The 80s was an era in which I think sitcoms really, really fulfilled a lot of their potential.
Absolutely. I think when you look at the sitcoms in the 70s and you look to the 80s, there's some pretty distinct differences in content, in just the diversity on camera even. I think it became a little more commonplace.
Well, you go from the Brady Bunch and Partridge Family in the first half of the 70s, and then you start building and you end up, now, we also talked about MASH started in the 70s, but it evolved more. Mm-hmm. And the shows those shows that carried over from 70s into 80s, you saw the changeover into more depth. Mm-hmm. Less clowning, more multi-layered messages. Mm-hmm. And I'm speaking about MASH. I'm speaking about Cheers. Yeah,
there were different thematic twists that weren't there before, or topics that maybe they wouldn't have dared breach in the 70s that were commonplace on TV in the 80s. They didn't shy away from a lot of the difficult family topics and things like that we saw.
I think one of the examples for that, talk about not shying away from things, was a whole different family balance. Mm-hmm. With the Brady Bunch, you had what they called a blended family. That was probably not the real life look of a blended family. I think blended families watched that show and said, that's not us. Mm-hmm. But I think when you watched a show maybe like, other than the comedy piece, Who's the Boss? Mm-hmm.
You got to see a more realistic picture of what dynamics looked like and what families themselves looked like, I think.
You had the head of the household was a female, an executive, ultimately an executive who develops her own advertising agency. We're talking about a very high-level executive, not seen a lot on television for young women and for girls, and that's what made these shows so appealing.
The other thing that I liked is it was never, there were moments where maybe the character was judged, but it never felt like the show was judging that character or instructing the audience to judge that character for being a working mom instead of a stay-at-home mom. Because sometimes older shows and older movies, you do get this, the mother who's working, there's this sense of like they're missing their kids' lives, but no one ever worried about the dad doing that. And I think, with Who's the Boss, she was still very active in their lives, but not always. And it never felt like the show was saying, she's messing up. she's doing it wrong. Cautionary tale.
I think they really did find a gem in Judith Light.
I love her. She's a goddess of all things
and
TV,
Tony
movie.
Danza as the co-star. I think
both of them are still acting phenomenally today. Judith Light is continuing in Broadway and on TV. Tony Danza just finished up a small arc on Broad City when it was on. So he's like, these are names that people still know. And they both were really talented and thriving actors in the 70s. Yep.
But these roles in this show, in Who's the Boss, elevated them, and they made the balance work. And they made the chemistry survive a lot of years.
Yeah. Which it can sometimes get stale on shows. You start to want other people involved, and I honestly would have been fine with the cast just as is forever.
Forever.
And obviously the kids grow up. But
right.
You know.
But it really did work. The nature of having a single mom, the nature of having a single dad, and their separate children living under one roof, and yet it worked, and it had the edge of risque, but it was not risque at all. This was an 8 p.m. show. Yeah. This was not a show.
The thought was scandalous, not the act.
Exactly.
That's the way I think of it.
And the other piece of this is I still remember how it kept going on, and you would see the characters get close. Oh, let's take a few steps back. Close. And until the show decided that it was time. And it would be its final season. They did not allow them to truly become a really solid couple until the final season. And near the end of it.
Yeah.
I remember Tony Danza's an interview he did. And if any of you had seen this, you may have heard this, because he's one of the first people to really say this out loud. He said he remembered watching I Dream of Jeannie. And the death knell for the series I Dream of Jeannie was when Jeannie and Tony got together and married.
Because then all the tension.
Everything's done.
Yeah.
The tension was truly over.
Yeah.
And so he was more than happy to not have Angela, and I think he played a Tony.
Yeah.
Not get together until the series had played itself out. And I think that's what happened, is it played itself out. And they knew that it had to be the end. So let's give the audience what they've been waiting for. Well,
and I appreciate that now. I don't know whether I appreciated it when I was young, because I didn't know anything about relationships. But I appreciate now that they didn't jump to, like, as much as that was an element, it wasn't the show.
No.
And I feel like there are so many shows now that would be so brilliant if they didn't just stick to the same trope of characters meet, a season of tension, characters date, a season of tension, characters get married, a season of tension, they have a baby. And then it just starts to feel really old, and you know what's going to happen to these characters. And it takes away from a lot of other subplots that, frankly, are more interesting sometimes.
And that was one of the shows that did it. I think I think Cheers, a whole different environment, because the family are completely unrelated.
Yeah, just
this was a little later in the evening, but you could watch with your older children, because Cheers took place in a bar.
Yeah,
and it was
not one that my parents let me watch. I don't think, just the bar background. You know,
the bar background and the characters who all truly were able to find family in their drinking buddies, their bar stool buddies in this bar, Cheers. And you had every type of personality, starting with someone who felt she was above being at a bar but worked there forever.
We all know that person too. Anyone who's worked in retail or a restaurant or bar knows that person.
That's right. And then the owner, who was this laid-back person who didn't seem too bright, but really was probably as smart as they come, which is why he has a successful business.
Yep.
And the family of friends who become your family. And all of these people were not like orphans in their homes. They talked about their spouses, their kids, their this. but you rarely saw them on this show. Very few of their extended family appeared.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, you know, when I think about it now, that's a really fascinating concept, to build these characters, and yet we only really see them in the one environment.
Yes.
Really. And there, you know, there are little bits and pieces outside of that, but it's kind of a fascinating thought to me now to observe a person in one habitat, and how does that reflect on who they are outside? You know, are they the same? Are they completely different? Is someone who's tough talking at the bar under the thumb at home? I don't know. Stuff like that just fascinates me.
And you wonder, but this ensemble became an ensemble family. And that's how we treated them. You know, every time Norm came in, you waited every episode for everybody at the bar to say, Norm! And you started saying it with them. That was part of almost the routine. I would watch with my husband, and we chimed in with everybody at the bar. It's
like a Rocky Horror Picture Show, but for TV.
Just Norm.
just Norm on chairs. Right, he's worth it.
He was worth it. And then on the flip side, we had dramas that really, this was not Dragnet. And Dragnet was pretty forward for its decade. But no, now we had Miami Vice, Cool White Jackets.
Oh, yes.
A little John Travolta thing, only in the cop version in Miami.
The bright neon shirts under
the cool white jackets, and it was, you know, the cops weren't all white.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was in Miami.
And I also think that, strangely enough, as much as we're talking about like the fashion of Miami Vice, I feel like a lot of times when people think of 80s, like when I think back to 80s parties that I attended, like the guys came in these like starched white blazers.
That's right.
Acid wash jeans. Like they came in, like a lot of the guys dressed like Miami Vice characters.
You either look like Miami Vice or something that was like post-disco with a rip, you know, the rip sweatshirt. It was one of the two.
Or like Madonna with the...
Oh, there you go. There you go.
There are like a few like style moments from the 80s that, for whatever reason, that's it. Like 8 scrunchies holding up your hair, like bright T-shirts. I don't know.
Or the warming up socks on your legs.
The leg warmers.
Leg warmers. And I have to tell you, those were the most uncomfortably warm things ever.
They're still not great now.
Unless it was really, really cold out. Why? Yeah. There was a lot of 80s fashion-wise, even on television, and that's where they were mostly started.
Every decade has its fashion-wise. Stirrup pants, like.
Okay, well.
I remember stirrup pants in the 80s, although for little kids, they're great because they keep their pants attached.
Well, stirrup pants came long before the 80s because I had to wear them to grade school. They became popular, and my first question for the world was, why? Why? I can put my sneakers on and not have my pants get crumpled up anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
Because that was kind of their purpose, was to anchor them. Yeah. But you had shows, like I was going to say, in the drama department, that's okay.
Fashion
so we had Miami Vice.
Yep. We
had the A-Team. Wow, what a mix.
Mr. T.
Mr. T. And boy, did he become a household name.
And it's funny because
And that mohawk actually became a hairstyle. Oh my God. Who knew?
I pity the fool. Still, people say that. And I think it's also funny because I think my generation and younger don't recognize him from the A-Team. We just know him as this public figure. Because I personally never watched the A-Team because it was too old for me, really, at that time. It was really
grown up. Yet,
but I
do remember people
100%
sitting down
knew
and watching that. And people would sit down in one of the big deal shows. And, you know, I loved girl power, woman power. That was really coming to fruition. We see it in Who's the Boss. We saw it in Growing Pains, where mom starts being the worker out of the house.
Yep.
Dad keeps his office in the house. And then you had Cagney and Lacey. 2 female cops, powerful, did what all the men do. Yep. And guess what? They also won the Emmys like all the guys did.
Yep.
They really, they brought it. I mean, Sharon Gless, I am still a huge fan of hers to this day.
Yeah.
In my mind, she can just walk on a TV screen and say hi, and I'd be like, give her the Emmy.
Yeah, give her everything she wants. She could be in any show. I really can't think of a show.
She elevates every show she's in.
She really does.
Her presence.
And I think, you know, Cagney and Lacey, what they did by being so strong, I mean, would Mariska Hargitay's character in Law & Order SVU exist if it wasn't for Cagney and Lacey?
I think you're absolutely right.
I mean, she was essentially the star of that show for how many years, you know? As much as there were other people, like the main central storylines really focused on her and her traumas and her work and her strength.
And the frightening things they went through.
Absolutely.
As women, being cops, still being women, and their vulnerability. And that show they did take out of the police department, and they put you out there with them, not only in their work, but in their home lives and how they had to balance that. And it was definitely what you would call 10 p.m. high drama. This was not a show that I would say family viewing with your young kids, but if you had teenagers.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think especially to demonstrate both to boys and girls how important this was. I think it sent a really strong message on where the world was going.
And I think you think of the 80s too as really a time of transition. There's so many different transitions, politically, socioeconomically, and television just kind of followed along that. But I think television
I agree.
Is often just a little bit faster in moving forward than
I think sometimes
society
television
is. It leads the
actually
way.
helped give a nudge.
Yeah.
Another way television was being given a nudge in family viewing and in all our viewing habits that really impact us today in a big way was the 80s was the year, this is my opinion, that cable really held its own and took off. This was when it went. Now, I learned something I hadn't known when I was doing a little bit of background check on the cable industry, was that cable actually started for places that couldn't get a signal back in 1948. I'm not sure what they were cabling in there back then.
1948.
You know, Life with Elizabeth with Betty White, I'm not sure you could get that on cable, but I'm just saying. But that's literally, cable started in 1948 in a couple of locations in 3 states, not Connecticut, that couldn't get signals. That couldn't get signals. However, then in the 60s and 70s, cable starts developing and moving into more metropolitan areas, but more as a channel. And I don't mean channel like you turn the channel on an adult TV set. Channeling the way we got television delivered. But then what happened was the beginning of home box office was brought into the world, and WTBS, Turner Broadcasting System, which was titled a superstation, developed by Ted Turner, and these became, now HBO, just home box office, for the record, was a pay. You had to pay extra to get that service, because what you got from that was you didn't have to go to the movies, and if you missed your movie in the theaters, it would show up uncut, unedited, and uninterrupted on TV. And you'd have this funny little box that you push buttons on. And that was it. There was no remote. It was like a little, it almost looked like a mini xylophone, like a child's little mini xylophone or baby
and
keyboard. You'd press a button, because it was only like, 30 or 40 little channels to choose from, and they didn't all work.
No.
It was a little tray, and you push the buttons, and that was what HBO was. But as far as joining cable networks, cable systems, if you got cable hooked up to your television in the 80s, you would get TBS out of Atlanta, which is where Ted Turner developed the company, which is
I didn't know that.
Huge to this day.
Yeah.
Nickelodeon was born in the 80s, or at least came certainly to fruition in the 80s. ESPN.
That blows my mind, because I think of ESPN as such a, I mean, maybe ESPN wasn't 24-hour days.
Oh, no.
Was it back then?
No.
I don't know. I think of it as such a contemporary channel.
But it was one ESPN. There wasn't ESPN 1, ESPN 28, ESPN 42.
The Ocho.
From
Dodgeball.
Just ESPN.
Yeah.
Just ESPN. And guess what? A whole family could watch a sporting event that they normally couldn't see on TV.
Yeah.
Because ESPN came into your home now, and you could sit as a family and watch that game together.
Which, I mean, I think about the fact that, radio stations for sports still exist, but I think they're far much less in use now because of television.
Absolutely,
now
without doubt.
You can order a package that gets you every NHL game, every NFL game, every Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball game. And that certainly wasn't the case prior to this, and certainly wasn't the case with ESPN
and even
when
more
it started.
So, when ESPN joined cable, you could also record on your VCR to tape a sporting event
having
that was going to go
flashbacks.
That would not start, let's say, until late in the evening for you, and you wanted to watch with the kids, and you'd watch that baseball game from LA that wasn't going to start till 8 p.m. LA time with your family the next day. And because there was no really active internet, there was internet, but there was not really active internet. There was certainly no social media going on.
No.
Guess what? You could get away if you didn't listen to the radio or look at the newspaper without knowing the score that whole day until you watched with your family as if it was happening then. So
it was so different now. We live in such a spoiler alert culture.
Yes, I feel like I should be saying spoiler alert
I know,
with everything we talk
seconds.
about. And that's kind of strange to think back now how neat that was. And you could also, because of VCRs also being brought out, is tape those lovely shows that you wanted to watch. I think the first time my daughter, who was 4 at the very end of the, she was turning 4 soon, but the end of the 80s, just before she turned 4, and it usually happened around the Christmas holiday time, The Sound of Music was going to air. Because it was airing at that point, it was beginning to air on TV on a regular basis. And I wanted her to get to see it. So I was able to tape it on our VCR and hold it for a time that mom and dad and daughter could sit down and watch The Sound of Music. And we all learned the incredible joy of the fast forward button when the commercials came.
It's so funny because I remember when I grew up, I thought all movies had commercials because there were so many VCR tapes that we had of stuff that we taped that I just assumed that. I still remember The Land Before Time and the commercial that came before it for Domino's Pizza, where they or Pizza Hut. I'm sorry, I can't remember, where they put like the spoons on their noses, and it's like still this very clear memory of all of them like messing around in a pizza joint with spoons on their noses, and then The Land Before Time starts. And it was just the way you did things. Like you said, there were so many things that I was able to watch with my parents that I wouldn't be able to watch previously because
it was on after bedtime.
It was on after bedtime. Bedtime was like 6:30, and the movie started at 7. It's not happening.
You know, and the truth is, a lot of the shows, really, sadly, because of that, ratings were augmented. Because now I believe we are at a point in ratings history that if you watch a show that's been DVR'd within, I believe it's 2 or 3 days, it gets calculated.
Nice. Yeah, that would not have been.
That was, of course, if you videotaped it on a cassette video,
I have no idea.
That was not happening. A couple of other things that happened in the 80s. Just to give you an idea why I say cable really came into its own, there were 28 cable networks at the beginning in 1980. The end of the decade, 79. And that's pretty big for back then because things were happening a little slower than they are now.
Well, and so many channels now, like you said, are second or third or fourth or fifth or 12th iterations of the same basic network.
And the pay-per-view, not pay-per-view, pay TV started expanding more and more and more. It wasn't just HBO anymore. They even had competition because for a long time, they were the only game in town was HBO. Soon they'll start doing a regular programming, but that really wasn't happening much back then, except on things like Turner. But even they were like broadcasting things that were already out there. Nickelodeon was beginning children's programming. We're going to talk more about that in the 90s because it really truly came into its
90s Nickelodeon.
MTV was developed in the 80s.
1981.
And took a hold. but it wasn't quite the family viewing.
No.
That was really a target audience.
Yeah.
You were in high school and college. I want my MTV.
Yep.
You were at home.
Controversial music videos.
Yeah. Mom, dad, and the kids weren't watching MTV together.
No.
Absolutely not. Now, I was in a sorority. We were watching MTV together.
Yeah.
Because we did want our MTV, and whatever we got from it, we loved.
Yep.
But we knew what we were watching. But I think what happened in the 80s is everything truly evolved. We saw it evolve from the sweetness, the beginnings like of Mary Tyler Moore and things like that in the 70s, developing in the late 70s, really beginning to find their own footing in more challenging subject matter, and the 80s went with it and ran. I think movies in the 80s and the theaters did that, and I think television in the 80s really started to truly take hold and say, you know what, let's either reflect real life, let's send the message we really want to send, and the message isn't that everybody necessarily lived happily ever after. You can have your happily ever after, but you're going to have a real challenge to get there. You're not. The challenge isn't going to be.
It wasn't pure idealism.
That mom burned the stew.
Yeah.
And oh my God, dad's mad. The challenge wasn't going to be that the kids are homesick, but the challenge was going to be the kids are homesick now. Which parent is going to stay home from their job?
I think you saw real family and relationship issues reflected more honestly.
Another show, you and I talked about this earlier, Family Ties, which gave Michael J. Fox his big break, really took the whole concept of issues and ran with it, including the issues that kids could be more conservative than their parents.
Yeah.
That option was out there, and it was viable. Now, they brought it to laugh level.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it was truly a viable option. And I remember watching that as a very young adult, thinking, ooh, that kid is really conservative. And thinking, yet that kid, they gave the intelligence to defend the conservative beliefs.
Yeah, it wasn't just a caricature.
So I think 1980s brought us from fluffy, even with issues, to the end. And thank you so much, Rachel, for this fun trip down into the 80s, and next time we see the 1990s and the results of the Emmys. So thanks again for watching Carolyn Talks Television with us.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.